back to Self Society. It is Saturday, October the 26th, 2024, and this is the 8th video on the model we're using to determine who is likely to win the 2024 U.S. presidential election. In the last projection, I believe it was about 3 days ago, we had Kamala Harris winning the states of North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and thereby winning for the presidential election. That was in the seventh, projection. Now, at the very first projection we did on this channel, we had Donald Trump winning, and then it was roughly a tie in the second one, then third and fourth. Kamala Harris caught up, and eventually by the seventh, she also picked up the state of North Carolina, putting her very comfortably winning close to 300 electoral votes. Now, we got a lot of new data coming in, and so far there have been a cast of well over, I think it was like 38 million votes by mail-in or early in-person so far cast nationally. And again, this is how we're putting together the data. We're looking on the NBC News Decision 2024 website, and we're looking at each of the states and how they fare thus far in votes cast up to now. For example, in Georgia, you can see that 49% of voters are Republican and 45% Democrat and 6% under the category of other. 2.6 million votes have been cast up to now. That means that this time, if we're not including independents, it looks like Republicans are winning the state of Georgia. Now, I do understand there are a couple of other things going on that we want to keep in mind. Number one, we don't know how the others are going to split. Typically, they do split about 55% Democrat and 45% Republican. That's how it's been in the past 3 elections, and that includes 2 times that Trump was the Republican candidate. The second thing that we typically notice is there's some shift of votes that go between parties. This time around, polling is suggesting roughly 6 to 9% of Republicans will be moving over to Democrats, and roughly 3 to 5% of Democrats will be shifting over to Republicans. In the end, that means there's essentially roughly about 2 to 3% favoring Democrats. So you can see there is a little bit of additional votes coming over to Democrats from the Republican side and the independent side. So I'm going to guesstimate about 2 to 3% when it's all said and done that we can add on to Democrats if we are at a state that looks as though it's basically tied, using only Republicans and Democrats. Now, the second data set that we're using is passing voting trends, and you can see that if you look at past voting trends, we see that starting in 1992, roughly 95% of all voters voted on election day. And then by the time we reached 2016, that had dropped to about 60%, dropping by about 3 to 5% each presidential election season. If we continue that trend, then we would expect about 50% of voters to show up on election day and the other 50% to show up early, either by absentee, by mail, or in person. What does that mean? Well, it means then that what we're seeing are numbers that are early, and we'll be expecting a lot more votes coming in actually on election day. The second thing we want to bear in mind is each one of these states have different voting histories. For example, you can see over here in my spreadsheet, right here highlighted Texas in 2022 midterm elections, 72% voted early, but only about 42% of that was of the total 62% that's expecting to show up early are Dem nationally. So I took basically 62% of 72% because this is a midterm election, which typically is much more heavily absentee ballot and less likely to show up actually on election day. But during use of presidential elections, people tend to be much more likely to show up in person. So that's why I did a multiplier that shows that Dems will be showing up much less than they would in a midterm. And same thing for GOP. The other thing that we noted in 2020 under President Trump competing with Biden, he had discouraged mail-in ballots, and so most people showed up for Republicans or to vote for Trump on election day, about 51% actually, compared to about 35% for Biden. So also factor that, and that's why you're seeing early votes for GOP is less likely. And polling also suggests that when GOP were asked will they be voting early versus showing up in person, roughly about 60% said they will be showing up about 50% that they'll be showing up on election day. And for Democrats, about 60% will be showing up on election day. So I factored all that in for to get a multiplier about who will be showing up during election day versus who will be showing up early. And then that multiplier is multiplied by the total number of votes cast so far in that state and what percentage was either Dem or GOP, and then we get a total. And I've also factored in roughly 55% independents going to Dem and 45% going GOP, and then Dems giving an additional about 1.5% shaved off of GOP, shifting over to Dems. With all of that, we then come up with a total here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go look through each one of these states and see if Kamala Harris is still winning the election, or did Trump catch up with these new batch of votes. We've had roughly about 15 million new votes since we last spoke. And I'm also going to black this out so we don't get distracted as we go state by state. So let's go ahead and start. You can see here I've got the map. Currently, I've got Texas, Florida as both battleground states, even though I think that's highly unlikely. But there's a lot of rumor going around about Harris presumably being able to win Texas or Florida, again, which I think is highly unlikely. But nonetheless, we'll go through each of these as an exercise to quell any concerns or questions we have around that. And then we also have state of Georgia as a battleground state, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Nevada. And let's go ahead and start with the state of Texas. And you can see so far, roughly 4.3 million votes have been cast in the state of Texas, and the gap between early votes coming from Dems versus GOP is widening. So it looks like it's becoming more and more less likely Democrats have any chance of taking the state of Texas, even with that additional 10%. So when it's all said and done, with our model, we're estimating Dems to pick up about 4.8 million and GOP about 6.6 million. So that's clearly favoring GOP. Now, another thing we want to bear in mind is that even with the polling, keep in mind that Donald Trump has been really pushing that this time around we want to go ahead and vote early. And this may be why you're seeing an increase of GOP show up. But outside of that, Dems don't really have a chance at this point. Because if it's typical they show up early versus later, and GOP already has a massive lead, then they just don't have a chance of catching up. That's the only one other scenario, again, is if, in fact, GOPs are really showing up much more heavily than they have in the past couple elections. And the second potential would be if enough GOP shifted over to Dems, which, again, I think is highly unlikely. So we're going to give the state of Texas over to Donald Trump. Bring it 232 for Harris and 183 Donald Trump. Moving on to our next state, and that would be the state of, I'm going to go ahead and move to the state of Florida. And in the state of Florida, so far, there have been an incredible 3.8 million votes cast. This is record turnout from a number of these states as well. But of those in the state of Florida, 44% have been GOP, 36% Dem. 20% of those are independent. Even factoring in the independents, because Dems are not showing up early compared to the GOP in the state of Florida, even with all of those various different adjustments I've made, GOP is ahead by almost well over 800,000 votes, with about 5.9 expected to Harris's 5 million votes. So again, I just think at this point, unless things drastically change in the next 10 days, it's very likely Florida is going to very easily go over to Donald Trump. 213 for Harris is 232. So let's go ahead and move on to the next state in the lineup. And I'm going to move to the state of Arizona. So just ignore for the moment the state of Georgia. We'll talk about that shortly. But right now, Arizona, there have been 1.1 million votes cast thus far. Again, GOP are just coming out in droves. 43% of those coming from GOP, 35% coming from Dems. And Marist polling suggests about 55% of the independents, which 22% of the vote cast so far in Arizona are independent, are expected to go to Dems, and about 43% with GOP. But that's still not going to be enough, because that's about, say, 5 to 6 votes, about 6 votes going to Harris versus 4 votes going to Donald Trump. That's just not going to be enough. So again, I think comfortably Donald Trump's going to pick up the state of Arizona as it stands today. 2.6 million is expected versus 2.2, roughly 3 million. So about $300,000 vote gap. And that's if the vote were held tomorrow. So those electoral votes will be going over to Donald Trump as it stands today. 232 to 222 Donald Trump. So, and then the next state I've got in mind here is the state of Georgia. And in the state of Georgia, there have been 2.6 million votes cast. 49% of those come from GOP, 45% coming from Dem, and only 6% coming from independent. Now, this is enough. If Harris can pick up enough of that 6% and also get enough of the GOP shaved off, she might be able to squeak by and pick up Georgia. But as it stands today, it looks like Donald Trump's going to pick about 4 million votes compared to Harris's 3.6 million. A 400,000 vote gap as it stands today if the election were held tomorrow. So currently, Donald Trump's picking up the state of Georgia, bringing him 240 to Harris's 232. Let's go ahead and move over to the next state in the lineup, and I'm going to move over to the state of, Nevada. And I think in that state, we've had, I think again, it's going to go GOP, but so far we have 546,000 cast, and 41% of those coming from GOP, 35% Dem, 24% coming from independents. And so this gap of 6% is going to be even more difficult than Arizona would be for, about the same, I guess, or Georgia rather, in terms of difficulty. Nevada will be more difficult for Dems to catch up compared to Georgia. But even if we counted independents and shaving off some GOP, looks like comfortably Trump is ahead in Nevada, 786,000 to 639,000, giving Nevada to Donald Trump, 246 to Harris's 232. So let's move to North Carolina. Currently, there have been 2.5 million votes cast, and that's a record for early voting. 33% of those have been from Dem. Now, in our last projection, it was tied at 34 each. 35% currently come from GOP, so they moved ahead. 1% moved toward GOP. That means 1% gets shaved off for Dem. 32% of independents voted in this election. That's a huge independent population, right, of voters. So it really, even with this 2% gap, it could go either way. But I haven't counted for that difference. And even with that, there's a vote difference of about 12,000 in favor of Donald Trump as it stands today. But again, because it's so close, that's just 12,000 votes. It's still, North Carolina could go to Harris. There's enough days for that to happen. But as it stands now, we're going to give North Carolina to Donald Trump. It brings them to 262 to Harris's 232. And the other thing we want to bear in mind is, where are the votes coming in? The early votes, are they coming in from urban areas where Democrats tend to vote more, where urban tend to vote for Dems more often than they vote for GOP? Or are they coming in more from rural areas versus urban areas where GOP tends to vote more? Right now, I don't have that kind of mapping. There's not a data set that I'm able to find that shows something with that degree of granularity. All right. So North Carolina is going over to Donald Trump. So that means it's coming down to the blue wall. and or the Midwestern states. Let's first start with Wisconsin. In the state of Wisconsin, currently 715,000 votes have been cast. 35% of those coming from Dem, 23% coming from GOP. Now, about a week ago, that was at 19%. So they picked up a couple of new percentages from and gotten that from the Dems. So that, but that gap is still quite large. Another thing too is 42% of Wisconsin are voting as independent. So that is tremendously large. And Wisconsin, we're expecting 4 or 5 million votes. And we've only gotten 715,000 so far. So it's still very early. But the election were held tomorrow with this data and using this model, we expect Harris to pick up with about a 216,000 vote gap, 816,000 to Trump's 600,000, giving her the state of Wisconsin. And that means we have 242 Harris, 262 Donald Trump. All right, now let's move to our next state, and that is the state of Michigan. And in the state of Michigan, we currently have 1.4 plus million votes cast, 52% of those coming from Dems, and 38% coming from GOP, 10% of those independent. And here's another thing. Again, Michigan's a state where GOP a couple days ago were sitting around 35%. So they picked up 3 additional percentages just in the last couple days. But is it going to be enough time? Well, even with our same-day voting, and we've adjusted using our multiplier, there's still a gap of almost 500,000 votes in favor of Kamala Harris over Trump in the state of Michigan. So it stands today, if the election were held today, or tomorrow that is, it would be Harris picking up Michigan's 15 electoral votes, bringing her to 257 to Donald Trump's 262. So it comes down to the state of Pennsylvania. And in the state of Pennsylvania, thus far, we've seen 1.2 million votes cast, 60% of those coming from Dems, 30% coming from GOP, 10% independent. Now, this just about 4 or 5 days ago was at 24%. So that's a 6% change just in about 4 days. They're basically picking up about 1% each day. So that's a rapid increase. But currently the gap is quite tremendous. We're expecting about 5 million votes for Harris and about 2.8 million for Donald Trump. But this gap actually was much larger in terms of percentage. It was about half for Trump and compared to Harris's votes. But as it stands now, it's more like 55 to 60%. So there's still time for Donald Trump to catch up and to take the state of Pennsylvania. But if the election were held tomorrow using this model with current votes cast using this model, we would expect that Harris would take the state of Pennsylvania. And so that brings her to 276 versus Donald Trump's 262. All right, now let's go back here. What do we have here? I'm looking at why we've got that 6 additional electoral votes. Utah. There, should be red. All right, should be 270. Sorry, apologize. To 268. I thought something looked wrong there. Now, if this were the way the election were held, I mean, like if this were the results of the election, this could become a problem because you would only need Donald Trump to contest one of these states, and you see the way he's denying the results of 2020 election, and he sued several states in 2020. My guess is he would sue the state, all 3 of these states, but focusing attention on Pennsylvania. So this could really, it might turn out that there might be some kind of contention that will come up after November the 5th that will make it not clear if all the electorates will cast their vote for Harris. So this is just how it stands today, and I'm speculating, and I don't know if that's how it's going to happen, but I am getting a kind of vibe of 2000, year 2000, in the way it happened with Bush versus Gore. We had very similar outcome where it went to the Supreme Court. So we could see something like that this time around. But anyway, this is how it stands today. And you can see that over the course of the last 3 or 4 days, it's beginning to shift back over to Donald Trump. But as it stands, barely Harris she's taking this map with 270 versus Trump's 268. All right, good day.